Hey guys, I hope you're ready for our read aloud. Sorry the video is kind of funky, but I'm trying to do it on my phone so that it will actually work this time. So we ended with Serafina, and remember her dad didn't believe her about the cloaked man, and so she went up. She was kind of mad at him, so she went up the stairs and went somewhere where she shouldn't at the Biltmore estate. Okay, and so there's all these beautiful people, and they have these fancy dresses, and so she's kind of scoping them out. Serafina looked at the face of the lady in the green dress, and then she looked at the face of the lady in the mauve hat. She knew her mama was long dead, or at very least long gone, but all her life, whenever she saw a woman, she checked to see if the woman looked like her. She studied the faces of the children too, wondering if there was a chance that any of them could be her brothers and sisters. When she was little, she used to tell herself a story that maybe she had come home one day to the house muddy from her hunting, and her mother had taken her downstairs and stuck her in the belt-driven washing machine, and then went back upstairs and accidentally forgot about her, just spinning and spinning away down there. But when Serafina looked around at the woman and the children in the entrance hall and saw their blonde hair and their blue eyes, their black hair and their brown eyes, she knew that none of them were her kin. Her pa never talked about what her mama looked like, but Serafina searched for her in every face she saw. Serafina had come upstairs with a purpose, but now she was there, the thought of actually trying to talk to any of these fancy people put a rock in her stomach. She swallowed and inched forward a little, but the lump in her throat was so huge she wasn't even sure she could get a word out. She wanted to tell them what she saw, but it suddenly seemed so foolish. They were all happy and carefree, like so many larks on a sunny day. She didn't understand. The girl was obviously one of these people, so why weren't they looking for her? It was like it never happened, like she had imagined the whole thing. What was she going to say to them? "Excuse me, everyone. I'm pretty sure I saw a horrible black-cloaked man make a little girl vanish into thin air. Has anyone seen her?" They lock her up like a cuckoo bird. As a tall gentleman in a black suit coat walked by, she realized that one of these men might actually be the man in the black cloak. With his shadowed face and glowing eyes, there was no doubt that the attacker had been some sort of specter, but she had sunk her teeth into him and tasted real blood, and he needed a lantern to see just like all the other people she'd followed over the years, which meant he was of this world too. She scanned the men in the crowd, keeping her breathing as steady as she could. Was it possible that he was here at this very moment? Mrs. Edith Vanderbilt, the mistress of the house, walked into the room wearing a striking velvet dress and a wide-brimmed hat. Serafina couldn't take her eyes off the mesmerizing movement of the hat's feathers. A refined and attractive woman, Mrs. Vanderbilt had a pale complexion and a full head of dark hair, and she seemed at ease in her role as hostess as she moved through the room. "While we wait for the servants to bring up our horses," she said happily to her guest, "I would like to invite everyone to join me in the tapestry gallery for a little bit of musical entertainment." A pleasant murmur passed through the crowd. Delighted by the idea of a diversion, the ladies and gentlemen streamed into the gallery, an elegantly decorated room with its exquisitely hand-painted ceiling, intricate musical instruments, and delicate antique wall tapestries. Serafina loved to climb the tapestries at night and run her fingernails down through the soft fabric. So it's kind of like curtains hanging down of fabric, like beautiful fabric. "I'm sure that most of you already know Mr. Montgomery Thorne," Mrs. Vanderbilt said with a gentle sweep of her arm toward a gentleman. "He has graciously offered to play for us today." "Thank you, Mrs. Vanderbilt," Mr. Thorne said as he stepped forward with a smile. "This whole outing is such a wonderful idea, and I must say you're a most radiant hostess on this lovely morning." "You're too kind, sir," Mrs. Vanderbilt said with a smile. To Serafina, who had been listening to Biltmore's visitors her entire life, He didn't sound like he came from the mountains of North Carolina or from New York like the Vanderbilts. He spoke with an accent of a Southern gentleman, maybe from Georgia or South Carolina. She crept forward to get a better look at him. He wore a white satin cravat around his neck, a brocade waistcoat, and pale gray gloves, of all which she thought went nicely with his silvery black hair and perfectly trimmed sideburns. He picked up a finely made violin and its bow from the table where it had been lying. "Since when do you play the violin, Thorne?" called one of the gentlemen from New York in a friendly tone. "Oh, I've been practicing here and there, Mr. Bendel," said Mr. Thorne as he lifted the instrument to his chin. "When? On the carriage ride here?" Mr. Bendel retorted, and everyone laughed. Seraphina almost felt sorry for Mr. Thorne. It was clear from their playful banter that Mr. Bendel and Mr. Thorne were companions, but it was equally clear that Mr. Bendel had serious doubts as to whether his friend could actually play. Seraphina watched in nervous silence as Mr. Thorne prepared himself. Perhaps it was a new instrument to him, and this was his first performance. She couldn't even imagine playing such a thing herself. At long last, he set the bow gently across the strings, paused for a moment to collect himself, and then began to play. Suddenly, the vaulted rooms of the great house filled with the loveliest music she had ever heard, elegant and flowing like a river of sound. He was wonderful, spellbound by the beauty of his playing. The ladies and gentlemen and even the servants stood quietly and listened with rapt attention, and they let their hearts soak in every measure of the music he made. Seraphina enjoyed the sound of his playing, but she also watched his dexterous fingers. They moved so fast over the strings that they reminded her of little running mice, and she wanted to pounce on them. When Mr. Thorne was done, everyone applauded and everyone congratulated him, especially Mr. Bendel, who laughed in disbelief. "You never cease to amaze me, Thorne. You shoot like a marksman, you speak fluent Russian, and now you play the violin like Vivaldi. Tell us, man, is there anything you're not good at?" "Well, I'm certainly not as skilled a horseback rider as you are, Mr. Bendel," Mr. Thorne said as he set his violin aside, "and I must say it has always been most vexing to me." "Well, stop the presses," Mr. Bendel called. "The man has a chink in his armor after all." Then he looked at Mrs. Vanderbilt with a smile. "So when exactly are we going horseback riding?" The other guests laughed at the two gentlemen as they quipped back and forth, and Seraphina smiled. She enjoyed watching the camaraderie of these people. She envied the way they spoke to one another and touched each other and shared their lives. It was so different from her own world of shadows and solitude. She watched a young woman tilt her head and smile as she reached out and put her hand on the arm of a young gentleman. Seraphina tried imitating the gesture herself. "Are you lost?" someone said behind her. Startled, Seraphina whirled around and started to hiss, but then she stopped herself short. A young boy stood in front of her. A large black Doberman with sharply pointed ears sat at his side, staring intently at her. A Doberman is a type of dog, like a guard dog. Very beautiful. Actually, I had one when I was in college. They're wonderful dogs. The boy wore a fine tweed riding jacket, a button vest, woolen jumpers, and knee-high leather boots. He was a little sickly looking, a little frail even, but he had wonderful sensitive brown eyes and a rather fetching tussle of wavy brown hair. He stood quietly staring at her. It took every ounce of her courage not to run. She didn't know what to do. Did he think she was a vagrant who wandered in? Or perhaps she looked like a day's servant, maybe a chimney sweep or a window washing girl? Either way, she knew she was stuck. He'd caught her dead to rights, exactly where she wasn't supposed to be. "Are you lost?" the boy asked again, but this time she heard what sounded strangely like a kindness in his voice. "May I help you find your way?" He wasn't timid or shy, but he wasn't overconfident or arrogant either, and it surprised her that he didn't seem angry at her for being there. There was a trace of curiosity in his tone. I'm not lost," she stammered. I was just..." "It's all right," he said as he stepped toward her. "I still get lost sometimes, and I've lived here for 2 years." Seraphina sucked in a breath. Suddenly she realized that she was speaking face to face with the young master, Mr. Vanderbilt's nephew. She'd seen him many times before, standing at his bedroom window, looking at the mountains, or galloping his horse across the grounds, or walking alone on the footpaths with his dog. She'd watched him for years, but she'd never been this close to him. Most of what she knew about him she'd overheard from the gossiping servants, and when it came to the young master, they sure did prattle on. When he was 10 years old, his family died in a fire, and he became an orphan. His uncle took him in. He became like a son to the Vanderbilts. So that is it for today. What do we think is going to happen between little Vanderbilt and Seraphina? We will find out tomorrow. See you soon.